In 2008, the Canadian government of the day launched a comprehensive study of the tax and regulatory burden faced by Canadian business. According to the authors of the report,
administrative tasks and excessive paperwork burden remain a long-standing distraction for business owners. Taking a broader view, the problem of excessive paperwork can lead to reduced business startups, trade and investment barriers, and an overall decline in economic productivity by making it relatively more expensive for Canadian businesses to operate. The study provided a breakdown of costs in the 2005 reference year. They then measured the costs 3 years later, at the conclusion of the study.
Sadly, they found that costs actually increased significantly during the 3-year term of the study.
In Figure 7 we see that costs per employee are much higher for our smallest businesses. During the 3-year study period between 2005 and 2008, costs increased by between 5 and 25%. Except for our largest businesses. For businesses with 100 or more employees, costs went down by about 13%.
This result underlines our policymakers' bias in favor of larger businesses. Unlike policymakers, business schools, and many professionals, SBA Canada understands that small business is very important and accounts for about 76% of private sector employment.
In Table 6 from the study, we see that income tax filing is the most commonly outsourced service by businesses of all sizes. This is followed by the preparation and remittance of regular monthly payroll deductions. The tendency to outsource these services actually increases as companies get bigger.
Income tax preparation and filing is very complex. It represents an almost impossible challenge for anyone not trained and experienced in Canadian taxation. In the next slide we'll visit Canada's Department of Justice website to get a sense of the extent of the challenge. For the moment though, it's important to understand that Canada's businesses overwhelmingly outsource income tax work, and that the tendency increases as companies grow.
Outsourcing payroll compliance is the second most outsourced service for businesses of all sizes. Like income tax, the tendency to outsource payroll increases as companies grow. However, payroll is not as technically challenging as income tax, and payroll support work is typically outsourced to specialist payroll firms. Professional accountants rarely provide monthly payroll services, although they often prepare and file annual T4 and payroll summaries for small businesses.
Canada's Department of Justice maintains a website which allows anyone to access legislation. The 19 most frequently accessed acts are listed, along with their size in kilobytes. If you were to add the number of kilobytes of each, the Income Tax Act itself accounts for fully 45% of the total. This gives you some sense of the relative complexity. Consider also that each province has its own separate Income Tax Act, and the technical challenge becomes apparent. When I worked in the tax department with one of Canada's largest accounting firms, we had a great many specialist groups within the tax department. These were broken down further by industry. We had specialists in mining, for example, as well as the technology sector. In Canada, businesses are overwhelmingly very small. Depending on how you define small business, there could be 3.8 million small businesses in Canada, averaging just 2.8 workers per business. Or you could say there are about 2.6 million self-employed workers and 1.2 million small employer businesses averaging just 7 workers each. No matter how you slice it or define it, most Canadian businesses are very small. In spite of this, they are very important. Together, they account for 76% of all private sector employment.
Many policymakers don't take small business seriously. Statistics Canada refers disparagingly to what they call micro-businesses with fewer than 5 employees. This is pretty hard to understand, particularly since there are only about 25,000 businesses with 100 or more workers, and together they employ less than a quarter of all private sector workers.
At SBA Canada, we know the size of a business is a key determinant of its compliance needs and the availability of staff resources to meet those needs. Like the Big Four firms that predominantly serve large and mid-sized clients, we know the importance of specialization.
While Statistics Canada's analysis is helpful, we have questions about its methodology and the definitions used to determine the cost of external service providers. Tax services provided to a self-employed individual and to most micro-businesses almost certainly includes bookkeeping and compilation services. Tax preparation services to a business with 50 or more employees would rarely include either bookkeeping or financial compilation services, since almost all such businesses have dedicated in-house staff doing that work. So, their study wasn't really comparing apples with apples. It's still useful, but we need to take the results with a grain of salt. About 10 years later, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business released a similar study in collaboration with Intuit Software, publishers of QuickBooks. Their findings found that Canadian small businesses fared very well in terms of paperwork costs when compared with their US-based neighbors. The one exception was when it came to the cost of professional accounting services. Here, that study found that Canada's smallest businesses paid as much as $1,000 more per employee when compared to American businesses of a similar size. However, we think it's clear that QuickBooks sees themselves as competitors with Canadian accountants in that segment of the market.
Perhaps coincidentally, the annual cost of a QuickBooks license for a small business is about $1,000. Did their study include that cost? From our perspective, the bookkeeping work done by most of our smallest businesses usually has to be redone at year-end. It's usually cheaper to start over from scratch than rely on improperly done bookkeeping work with only a rudimentary audit trail. What's more, we think it's clear that QuickBooks see themselves as competitors with Canadian accountants in that segment of the market.
At the Hatchery, we've partnered with the Small Business Analysts Society of Canada to help simplify the tax and accounting needs of Canada's smallest businesses, those that make up about 80% of all Canada's businesses, and support more private sector workers than all of Canada's large and mid-sized companies combined.